building this outdoor seating area, and we said, fine, do it. And it's been there ever since. It's one of the, when I walk past there, I have to think sometimes that's one of the consequences, the unintended consequences of the fiscal crisis are those, is that outdoor seating area.
Any other questions on the CUNY?
What else have we got?
What else that happened like during the fiscal crisis and the period after it, like still affects CUNY to this day? Like any policy changes and situational changes with CUNY?
Well, in the largest sense, by being an agency of the state, we had to live with state rules and regulations. They're still in effect today. The community colleges, which are subject to city rules and regulations, are operated on a somewhat different level than we are. And so that for CUNY, that major decision, moving from city oversight to state oversight, entailed a large measure of new rules and regulations having to deal with program approval. How do we approve a program? It has to go to the state. How do you approve a new course? It has to go to the state. All those things are with us today. We've just sort of, I guess, it's become part of our daily lives, but in 1976, all this was new. And a lot of stuff had to be created that obliged us to abide by state ethics laws, by state conservation, sustainability laws, by the laws of that the state passed on the fiscal expenditures and controls, by the laws that the state passed on the disposal of toxic products, for example, in the chemistry labs. All those things didn't exist beforehand. It also, and to this day, exists a large office here on campus for financial aid. We didn't have any financial aid when there was no tuition. Who needed financial aid when you had no tuition? So since then, we had to create a number of new offices, which are still with us today. Financial aid being an obvious one. We created new offices for testing, for scholarships. There was no need for a scholarship when you didn't have to pay anything. So at CUNY in general, and Brooklyn College in particular, we learned to live with new offices, new staff, people who had expertise that we never had before. That called for a large, I mean, in a kind of paradox, it called for more people on campus than we had before because there were new responsibilities. And even though we couldn't hire new faculty, we had to hire financial aid counselors, we had to hire people who oversaw the whole testing system, so that we found ourselves in this odd situation of having to add staff even though we were basically broke. And so as the faculty declined in number, the staff began to increase, which was a very strange experience for us because we had always thought the faculty was the major resource that we had and therefore was the largest component of our staff, of our employees. Today we have a total number of employees, full-time and part-time, about 2,000, of which approximately 1,200 are full-time faculty and staff, of which slightly more people are staff than faculty. And by staff, I mean everybody from cleaners and custodians and secretaries up to the president. So, but this balance did not, it evolved over time. It did not exist in those years. And suddenly in '76, we discovered our having to hire people that we would not have dreamed of hiring 6 months earlier because of the changes. The whole system, and now that you ask that question, it comes back to me, the whole system of financial aid is totally new since '76. And the need for the college president to raise money from alumni to pay for scholarships all goes back to those years. When alumni gave us money in those years, it was for giving awards or prizes. Nobody needed money for tuition. So those things also had and this might be an interesting thing to pursue for you, had subsequent consequences. There was a sort of a long tail. Once you start tuition, you gotta have financial aid, you gotta have scholarships, you have to have financial aid counselors, scholarship holders, you gotta have rules on how to check people's attendance so that you don't give scholarship money or financial aid money to students who no longer attend class. So you run into a whole series of cascading rules and regulations that you wouldn't have dreamed about, 5 months earlier. And we discovered ourselves being a much more bureaucratic institution than we were before the fiscal crisis. A bureaucracy and a bureaucratic institution with rules and regulations that continues to this day. If you think of what we do today with the way in which you are checked on, well, you always check for transcripts and graduation requirements, but the way in which you are checked on other things that affect your daily lives, most of them date from '76 or thereafter. We were very simplest college before then.
The tuition of CUNY, as you mentioned, was $600 at first. Did this tuition slowly increase until today, or were there fluctuations that reflect the changing times?
Usually, tuition went up in bad times.
Yeah.
And they should be going up in good times, but they tend to go up in bad times. I've always thought that if you were to hire a consultant to say, develop for me the worst possible tuition system, they would have come up with a system. We've somehow, and this is a political issue rather than a fiscal issue, we've somehow developed a system where we go for a long time in which we are the same tuition, and then suddenly we have a big spike. And then we go up this way, and then we have a big spike again, which means really that the people who have to pay the big spike are paying all those, subsidizing all those who went before them. Whereas a more rational system would be sort of annual increase of 2%, so you can plan. You can't plan with a spike. You suddenly discover you're a junior and next year it's going to be $600 more. Well, if you had known when you arrived here that every year you're going to pay $100 more, you could have budgeted that in, you would know. But the state has never adopted that because the politicians, the elected officials, do not like to increase tuition. It's a tax, and nobody likes to tax. And so you only tax when you're desperate, which is the worst possible time to tax. I mean, it's a paradox that no one has ever been resolved, and maybe when you guys become rich and famous and influential, you can figure out how to do this. But we've not had a good system. I've always thought that you could graduate with the same tuition, and suddenly your successor immediately thereafter has to pay 30%, 15%, whatever it is more. It's not a good system. But it's always been that way, and now, as you know, we go up to 4,600. Yeah. So we have come a long way since 1976, when 600 was thought to be the limit.
So what accounts for these hikes? Like the first hike was from 0 to 600. When
Right.
did the second hike happen, and why?
The second one was probably 1980, 81, when there was another significant economic downturn. But in each case, it was because the state was cutting back on its support, was disinvesting in higher education. And in order to make the university keep going, to provide services that you need and want, the burden was passed on to students. So we now have a system where 70% of our operating budget, what we pay for salaries and student services and all that, comes from tuition. And only 30% comes from the state. That's a long way from 1976, when it was 100% from the city, that is. So that when the state took us over, the deal was, we will take the university, but we will not fund it 100%. We will fund it, I'm guessing, 80%. And ever since then, it's been going downhill. And the state is paying for more and more social services. Health costs are expensive. Medicaid is an expensive drain. The school system, grades K through 12, is an expensive thing. So higher education has been reduced. The support of higher education has been reduced year after year after year.
So every time that there was this tuition hike, basically, did the CUNY system and Brooklyn College adjust to it, or was there a ripple effect that reflected in like lower